That we have discussed the basic definition of law, it is necessary for us to look at the various kinds of law that we experience. And from a theological perspective, we can identify essentially four types of law. The first type is called the eternal law. The second is the natural law. And the eternal and the natural law will be two concepts that we tend to join together and speak of at the same time. I will deal with them separately at first, and then moving forward, we'll look at them a little more closely together. The third is the human law, and fourth is the divine law. Now, on the surface of it, it may seem that the eternal law and the divine law are the same thing. They are not. And so, as you can see, that's why I have separated these four out so that we deal with them separately. But the eternal law and the divine law are definitely separate. And so let's look at them specifically. The first is the eternal law. The eternal law is essentially God's design or plan for creation. Okay, God as a creator had a plan or a design in his mind for creation. He then created, and not only did he just create, he continues to provide. That's where the providential comes in. He provides the being, the existence of all creation. He cares for creation, drawing it to its fulfillment. Right? He didn't just set it in motion and walk away. He provides continuously for the existence and the care of creation. But in creating, he had kind of a design or a plan. And just like any other inventor or creator, we might have a plan for something, and then eventually something in our invention or our creation breaks down and it starts doing what it's not supposed to. All right, so it's God has this plan and He cares for it, and He expects it to go a certain way. And so, to an extent, there's an eternal law which is at work in all of creation. And so, if we take that and apply the four concepts or components of the definition of law, law is an ordinance of reason. Well, the eternal law comes from the divine mind, the divine reason. All right, it comes from God's mind, the ultimate reason. It is for the common good. Well, the eternal law is directing the natural good of all creation. The first natural good is existence, and the second is fulfillment. Right? Through God's eternal law, He creates, He gives things existence, and then He draws things to its fulfillment. It's developed by a competent authority. Well, the competent authority here is God Himself. God Himself is the competent authority for all of creation. And finally, it must be promulgated. Right? How is the eternal law promulgated? Well, it's promulgated in creation itself. This is where we can say, and this is the basis of, we can look at creation and see the signature of the Creator. We can see signs that God exists simply by looking at creation. St. Paul uses this method in the Areopagus when he is talking to the Greeks about the unknown God. God is evident through creation. St. Thomas Aquinas does this in his 5 ways of proving God's existence, and that we can see God evident in His creation. And so we can see that the eternal law is indeed a type of law and is different from the divine law, which we will look at later. The important part here is that the eternal law it pertains to the natural good of creation. He's created things to be a certain way, and He expects them to go this particular way, and He provides for them to go in a particular way. The second law is the natural law, and the natural law is what is tied most closely to the eternal law. All right, so God has created, and He's created with a particular plan, and He provides for that plan for all things to reach their fulfillment. But at the same time, He's created humans, and humans are intellectually free, so to speak. He's created humans with free will. Natural law is really just the human person's participation in the eternal law. All right. God provides for everything in creation, even for humans, but at the same time, He allows humans to choose. All right. Just as we saw in the lecture on the definition of law, that law appeals to reason. Even the eternal law appeals to reason. God does not force our hand, He allows us to choose. All right. How do we choose to abide by the eternal law? Well, we choose by the natural law. What is the natural law? It's our specific participation in the eternal law. How do we do that? Through our reason, right? By our reason, we recognize the eternal law in creation. This kind of corresponds to the final bullet point on the previous page here, evident in creation. So through our reason, we look at creation, we recognize that there is a plan, there's a signature of a creator, of a divine mind that has set this plan, intellectual design, so to speak, of all of creation. We recognize that. And when we recognize that, especially for the human person, we see that everything's directed towards a natural good. And so we choose to live in accord with that natural good, not only our good, but the good of those things around us, and most especially those other persons around us. So we direct our actions to our good and the good of others. And in doing this, in directing our actions to our good and the good of others and the good of all creation, we ultimately fulfill the will of God's design. God has designed creation to work in this way, and we, by participating in it through the natural law, fulfill God's eternal law. And so these concepts of eternal and natural law go kind of hand in hand. The third type of law is human law, right? So humans recognize in creation this underlying eternal law, which we participate in as the natural law, and we direct our actions kind of accordingly. Well, eventually in daily life, in practical matters, specific circumstances, situations come up. We need to act in a particular way, or we need to figure out how we should act in this particular circumstance. And eventually, through history, what is developed is what is known as human law. All right, and this is what we see now in our civil law, criminal law governing strategies. All right, this is why human law can vary from culture to culture. When you look at the laws of the United States versus the law of Canada versus the law of European countries versus the law of African nations, you're going to see vast differences, and that's okay because it is the application of the natural law to specific circumstances in specific cultures, which are going to vary. It's amazing, though, that you're going to see a much more significant comparison than you will a contrast, meaning you're going to see more similarities than differences, but the differences can still be pronounced. And even if you look at our culture in the United States here, you have local versus state, regional versus federal. You're especially seeing that now in the COVID-19 pandemic, where the state governments are taking a very active role in certain things, and the federal governments are kind of doing their own things, but there's a vast difference between how states are handling things. We have seen throughout history the difference between civil law and criminal law. Criminal law, resulting in criminal punishments for violating crimes versus civil law, where legal lawsuits are brought up. And then you have specific types of law that pertain to specific types of actions or other things. You might think of property law, family law, tax law, sports law. Various sectors of law depending upon the object that is concerned. And so you have human law. Human law can also not just vary from culture to culture, but it can vary over time. At one point in time, we didn't have digital law or technological law because we didn't have something like the internet or computers, but now we do. At one point in time, there was not intellectual property law. Intellectual property law only came about after the printed word. So only after the printing press in the 1500s do we have something like intellectual property law, and the fact that an idea that I come up with can be, quote unquote, my idea versus someone else's. Finally, you have the divine law. And here's where we have to make a distinction between what is the eternal law and the divine law. Right? So the eternal law simply pertains to the natural good of creation. God created human beings to be a certain way naturally. Um, God created frogs to exist in a certain way for a natural purpose, and so they have their natural goal that they fulfill in the created order. Same thing for rocks, trees, birds, water. Anything that we can look at in creation, everything has a natural good, a natural fulfillment that it seeks. But the human person alone has a supernatural destiny, right? The rest of the created order, um, everything that we can see in nature, has a natural destiny. The human person has a supernatural destiny. What does that mean? It means that at the end of time, at the end of creation, when all passes away, humans will remain and will have a supernatural destiny that is God Himself. The rest of creation will not. All right, so the human person, man, has God as his supernatural destiny, his supernatural good, right? For that reason, in order to get to that, in order to fulfill that supernatural good, man must act in a particular way. Well, in order to act for a supernatural good, you need a supernatural law. All right, that's the divine law. So man needs this divine law for four reasons. As I've already stated, the supernatural good of God as our ultimate destiny requires a supernatural law in order to act accordingly and thus fulfill our destiny of a supernatural good. Second, man's judgment is uncertain, especially due to original sin. And because man's judgment is uncertain, he needs that divine law to guide him in his destiny. Third, we are body soul composites, meaning we are both physical and spiritual, but God is divine and therefore purely spiritual, which means we are very incompetent in judging spiritual things because all of our knowledge is first and foremost based upon our five senses, which pertains to the physical order. But in order to reach our ultimate destiny, our divine good, which is God, we must be able to judge spiritual things. Well, we need help. We need help judging spiritual things because we don't live exclusively by the spiritual things or the spiritual realm. And so, because of that incompetence, we require divine law. And last but not least, human law, which we can formulate, is inadequate, especially when it comes to forbidding all evil. Law must forbid all evil in order that we can seek only what is good. Well, we fail at that. In order to forbid all evil, we must be essentially all-knowing, and we are not. And so our law will always be flawed in that regard. And so God gives us the divine law in order to be able to forbid all evil so that we can seek only what is good. Right? So where do we find the divine law? This is the simple part. It's found in divine revelation. Right? We find it in Scripture. We find it in sacred tradition. The Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, the Mosaic Law. Anytime there's a prohibition, thou shalt not, or you shall not. Anytime there's a major command to do something, that's the divine law. In the New Testament, we see this especially in the teachings of Christ, the two greatest commandments: love the Lord your God, and love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Beatitudes, blessed are those who are persecuted. All of these teachings that we find in sacred scripture are part of the divine law. So, just to summarize, those are the four types of law: the eternal law, the natural law, which are closely joined together, the human law, and the divine law.